You think you know someone, until you find out what they were really thinking. Johnny Carson smiled at him, shook his hand, laughed at his jokes. Did it night after night for years, in front of millions of people. But the moment that camera cut away, his expression changed. His tone shifted. And the people closest to him knew Carson despised this man. Quietly. Deeply. And for reasons he never once spoke about publicly. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the real Johnny Carson, the one the audience never got to see. The one who kept his true feelings locked behind that legendary smile. Because what happened behind the scenes of The Tonight Show was nothing like what you watched at home. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unsee it. Johnny Carson spent 30 years in front of a camera, but his real power had nothing to do with comedy. It had everything to do with reading people. Night after night he sat across from the biggest names in entertainment. He listened. He watched. He studied. He had this quiet, almost surgical ability to see through rehearsed charm, through carefully constructed public images, through the performance that most people mistook for the real thing. That ability made him legendary. It also made him dangerous, because once Carson decided something was off about you, that feeling never left. When James Stewart walked onto his show, everything on the surface looked perfect. Carson welcomed him warmly, smiled, kept the conversation easy and light. Two respected men, enjoying each other's company. The audience loved it. But backstage? The staff noticed something different. When Stewart's name came up for booking, Carson's expression would shift, just slightly, just enough for the people who knew him to catch it. He'd question the booking in a way he didn't do with other guests. Not with anger. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like deep, unshakable doubt. Carson had built his entire career on one thing: authenticity. He respected honesty, even messy honesty. What he could not stand was someone who felt too perfect. Too smooth. Too carefully arranged. And James Stewart, in Carson's private view, was exactly that. The real problem wasn't what Carson could see. It was what he was hearing behind closed doors. Carson wasn't just a television host. He was deeply connected to the people who ran this industry from the inside. People who had seen things that never made the papers, never made the evening news, never made it anywhere near the public record. And what he began hearing about Stewart didn't match the image. He started learning details about Stewart's private life, specifically, about his role as a father to his adopted sons. What Carson heard suggested a coldness that stood in shocking contrast to the devoted family man Stewart presented to the world. A distance. A lack of warmth. A gap between the values Stewart talked about publicly and how he actually lived. For most people, this might have stayed a rumor. A piece of industry gossip easily dismissed. For Carson, it became a verdict. Then came the moment that sealed it. Stewart's son was killed during the Vietnam War. It was a devastating, heartbreaking loss, and the public responded with genuine grief and sympathy. Then Stewart appeared on television. He read a poem, his voice trembling, his eyes filling with tears. It was one of the most emotional moments in television history. Audiences were deeply moved. Critics called it raw. Real. Honest. Carson watched that moment and felt something completely different. To him, it didn't feel raw. It felt controlled. It felt, and this is what haunted him, like a performance. Like grief being used to reinforce an image. Like something deeply personal being carefully packaged for public consumption. That was the moment Carson's doubt turned into something he could no longer explain away or ignore. It wasn't disappointment anymore. It was disgust. Quiet, private, permanent disgust, the kind that doesn't fade, doesn't soften, and doesn't leave room for second chances. He never said a word about it publicly. He never challenged Stewart on air. He kept doing his job, kept smiling, kept the show running. But in his mind, the decision had already been made. And it never changed. But James Stewart wasn't the only one. If you think Carson's tension with one guest was complicated, wait until you hear what happened with Frank Sinatra. Because this one didn't stay quiet. This one exploded. Carson and Sinatra were two of the most powerful men in American entertainment, and for a long time, they managed to coexist with polite smiles and professional courtesy. Then Carson made a joke during his opening monologue. A joke that touched on Sinatra's personal life and the people connected to him. Sinatra was furious. Within hours, the television network was calling Carson. Sinatra wanted a public, on-air apology. Not a private conversation. Not a quiet acknowledgement. A public apology, broadcast to millions of people, because Frank Sinatra expected nothing less. Carson thought about it. Then he said no. He believed in his right as a comedian to make jokes. He believed that apologizing would set a precedent that would quietly destroy everything that made him effective as a host. So he held his ground, and Frank Sinatra never forgot it. Sinatra stopped appearing on The Tonight Show entirely. That was a blow, not just creatively, but commercially. Sinatra brought viewers. His absence sent a message to others in the industry. Quietly, certain circles began creating distance from Carson's program. Other major guests who ran in Sinatra's world started appearing on competing shows instead. Then came 1974. Carson, hoping to finally close the wound, met Sinatra privately in Las Vegas. He approached the meeting calmly, reasonably, ready to move past it. Sinatra humiliated him in front of a room full of people. He made personal remarks. Sharp, cutting, designed to embarrass. Carson didn't respond. He absorbed it and walked away. But everyone in that room saw it, and Carson felt it for years afterward. At a public charity event shortly after, Sinatra made remarks about Carson again, this time in front of a crowd. Carson stayed silent. But after that night, he made a quiet decision. No jokes about Sinatra. No comments about Sinatra. No indirect mentions, no subtle references, nothing. The name simply disappeared from his show. The people around Carson noticed immediately. Because this wasn't just professional caution. This was personal. And Carson didn't let many things become personal. The conflict was never resolved. Both men were too proud. Both men had too much at stake. And so the distance stayed, fixed, cold, and permanent, until the very end. But even that wasn't the strangest dynamic Carson had to manage on his own stage. Milton Berle had been famous since the earliest days of television. He carried that history with him like armor, and he used it. Every single time he appeared on The Tonight Show, the balance between host and guest quietly began to collapse. He would interrupt. He would redirect. He would step into conversations that weren't meant for him and make them about himself. What was supposed to be a shared space became, slowly and consistently, a one-man performance. And it didn't stop when the cameras went off. Backstage, he moved freely through spaces meant for preparation, for a staff, for quiet work. Dressing rooms, work areas, private corners. He walked into all of it without warning or apology, continuing to perform, continuing to hold court, as if the entire building existed for his benefit. There were also deeper concerns. Younger performers, writers, comedians trying to find their footing, they felt exposed around him. Their jokes, their ideas, their fresh material, none of it felt entirely safe. That created an imbalance of power that Carson found genuinely difficult to ignore. Because at its core, what Carson was watching was fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Fear of being forgotten in an industry that was moving forward without stopping to look back. And that fear was pushing behavior that hurt people who had no way to protect themselves. Carson managed it. Carefully. Quietly. He held back his reactions, chose his words with precision, and kept the show moving forward even when the situation behind the curtain was becoming genuinely uncomfortable. But it cost him something, every single time. Burt Reynolds brought a completely different kind of tension. On camera, he was exactly what audiences expected, relaxed, magnetic, and effortlessly entertaining. But off camera, the priority was image. Every detail of appearance had to be precisely right. The lighting, the angle, the framing, small issues could rapidly escalate into large disruptions that slowed production and put the entire staff on edge. Conversations behind the scenes consistently circled back to his own stories, his own achievements, his own experiences. Not because he was unintelligent, but because there was a compulsive need to remain the center of whatever room he was in. There were also moments involving female guests that created genuine discomfort. Comments framed as humor that didn't land as humor. Situations where Carson had to quietly guide the conversation in a different direction without drawing attention to why he was doing it. And when facts were gently challenged, or when questions arose that required a moment of honest self-reflection, the response was almost always the same: defensive, closed, redirected back toward control of the narrative. Carson began to see the pattern clearly. Charm and talent were not the same as character. The more successful someone became, the thicker the layer of protection around their behavior. And the harder it became for anyone, including the host of the most watched late-night show in America, to hold them accountable. Joan Crawford arrived and the entire atmosphere of the building changed before she even sat down. The lighting had to be perfect. The room had to feel exactly right. Every single detail had to meet her specifications, and if something was off, even slightly, the tension that followed was immediate and heavy. What the staff noticed most, however, wasn't the demands themselves. It was the way she treated people differently depending on their status. Those with power and influence received warmth, even genuine charm. Those in lower positions, the crew members, the assistants, the people quietly keeping the show alive, were treated as if they barely existed. A small mistake from someone in a lower position could trigger a reaction that was sharp, public, and deliberately humiliating. And then the cameras would turn on. Her expression would soften. Her voice would warm. Everything about her would shift into the version the audience recognized and adored. Then the moment filming paused, it all disappeared again, instantly, completely, without transition. Staff began to see it as two completely separate people sharing the same body. And the question that kept surfacing, which one was real, never got a comfortable answer. Orson Welles presented a different kind of challenge. His intelligence was genuine, his presence commanding, his conversation genuinely fascinating at times. But structured television operates on timing, preparation, and trust between a host and guest. Welles respected none of those things. Pre-planned questions were dismissed without acknowledgement. The signals that indicated it was time to wrap up were ignored. He spoke about crew members as if they weren't standing directly in front of him. At one point, he began directing camera operators, actual instructions, about how they should be filming, as if his role as a guest gave him authority over the production itself. Every appearance required extra preparation, extra management, extra patience from everyone involved. His talent wasn't in question. But talent alone couldn't carry the weight of what he demanded from the people around him. Bette Davis brought an energy that could fill a room, and consume it entirely. During group appearances, the conversation had a way of consistently collapsing back to her. Not always through obvious interruption, but through a steady, persistent gravity that pulled focus away from others without anyone being able to point to exactly how it happened. Younger, less experienced guests found themselves quietly edged out of moments that were supposed to belong to them. Off camera, her comments towards staff could turn sharp without much warning. In at least one situation, her behavior required direct intervention, something that almost never happened on a production built around making guests feel comfortable and welcome. Mickey Rooney's issues were different in nature but equally serious. His energy was high, but his behavior around female staff members created an environment of persistent discomfort. People began quietly rearranging their own schedules to reduce the chance of direct contact with him. There were also appearances where his condition raised real concerns about his ability to perform live, situations that required careful, discreet management to prevent something from going wrong on air. Zsa Zsa Gabor's demands were specific, detailed, and completely non-negotiable. The room had to be arranged in a particular way. Certain preferences had to be honored exactly. If anything at all, was not precisely as she required, production slowed. Schedules shifted. What should have taken minutes stretched into something much larger. Staff learned to arrive earlier, prepare more, anticipate everything, because the cost of getting it wrong was always higher than they could afford. What all of these stories share is the same quiet, persistent truth that Carson spent 30 years watching unfold night after night behind the curtains of his own show. The audience saw polished. They saw charming. They saw talent and charisma and the carefully constructed image of people at the height of their power. What the staff saw was something else entirely. Carson saw both versions. Every single night. And it shaped him in ways that never fully showed on screen, a quiet, deep, permanent understanding that fame doesn't reveal character. It hides it. It protects it. It builds walls around it that most people never get close enough to look past. He carried that knowledge with him for decades. And he never let it show. If this kept you watching, you already know why. The real stories are always the ones they tried to keep quiet. Like and subscribe, and click the next video. There's more where this came from.